The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Hey guys, and welcome back to Lighting Controls Podcast. We have another fantastic episode for you today, but before we jump into our conversation, let me take a minute to remind everyone, today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors. Check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com. We've got all of our episodes, a news feed, a merch store, training opportunities, and information on our council on lighting control startup and integration if you want to get involved. Additionally, this is an unsponsored episode, so just going to pitch our companies here, Penumbra Controls, for outreach and education. If you want to learn more about lighting controls, please reach out to Webster at penumbracontrols.com or check out the website penumbracontrols.com. And then Ron's going to talk to you briefly about Port.
And of course, Port Lighting, we're located up in Seabrook, New Hampshire. We cover most of the Northeast. We're a dealer integrator. The other side of our company does production. So we kind of cover the full gamut as far as lighting and controls goes at your disposal at any time.
Awesome. Well, so today we've got a special guest for you, Anthony. Anthony, do you mind just giving us a quick breakdown on who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so hi, my name's Anthony. I've been kind of mainly inside of the house of worship market for the past 10 years as a lighting designer and consultant to kind of go along with that. So, building churches was kind of my bread and butter for that time. Throw in, of course, that little bit of freelance of concerts, touring, festivals, corporate. You kind of name it. You know how it goes inside of the entertainment market. Once you kind of have to do a little bit of everything, which is always fun. Kind of got out of that about 2 years ago and kind of changed my fields a little bit. And so now I kind of work for, a sales and distribution company, managing through some network lighting products and other lighting products inside of it. And then from there, it's kind of just stayed in consulting at this point, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, house of worship is such a unique kind of application and installation. And so for our listeners, would you mind just explaining how house of worship might differ slightly from your standard commercial kind of construction projects?
Yeah, houses of worships are these very involved processes around things because everything is an experience. Everything is like, how do we engage congregants as they're coming into the church? And then it's also about creating these environments. I mean, it's not enough just to create a pretty space or to create something that is, nice to be inside of. But, the ultimate goal, if you will, is to create spaces for people to feel comfortable to relate to whichever, religion they're trying to relate to inside of churches. Saying that very generically across the board. I was mainly a non-denominational kind of a church person, did a lot of First Presbyterians, First Baptists, and every single denomination, of course, has their own different flavors on how everything kind of sits. You're not walking into a non-denominational church down here in the Southeast and then going over to Texas and finding the same level of church all the way through. And so it's always this very weird and strange kind of thing to go with it. But everything's an environment, and it's a very particular environment per church.
Cool. All right. Before we kind of jump into that a little more, I would love, just because there's probably a lot of people listening who are based in certain areas of the country who may not have very large churches, right? Like up in the Northeast, a lot of our churches are very small. So when you're talking about these houses of worship, what size congregation, how large are these churches?
Typical church that I've done work on side of, we're talking anywhere between like 2,500 to 3,500 seats. And then I've worked in churches that are up to, 14 to 15,000, bringing in roughly 32,000 people on a weekend physically inside of the space.
Right.
And so these numbers get really crazy, really fast. Personally, I like the smaller churches. I love working with the smaller churches. I like that 500 to 1,000 person kind of a range. And a lot of it is simply just because I like solving problems and finding creative solutions to things. And you have to find a lot more creative solutions when you're looking at a budget of a church that's 500 to 1,000 versus a church that's like, oh yeah, we've got 34,000 people coming in per weekend. Do some very rough math inside of your head and you can find some budgeting numbers really quick. So it just, it's crazy how it goes.
Yeah. Totally. Well, and I think that right there kind of isolates one of the challenges already, which is budget. But then also with budget comes scale in a lot of cases. And so you can't just go, well, we're going to take a small church and quadruple whatever the design is, and then we've got ourselves a larger church. You really have to dial into what the needs of the congregation are. And so how does that conversation go usually?
Yeah, and this is where I'll give a quick shout out actually to the AVL installers that are very house of worship based, because they have a job. Because there is no church that is cookie cutter. You can't just say, "Oh yeah, we're just going to scale this up and be done." You really do have to go into the meat and potatoes of every single system uniquely for that church, because one, they're looking for this particular thing and they're looking for this particular environment, and then you have to find the right things that fit within the budget to go between it. It sounds weird to say you still have budget constraints, even though you've got the larger, budgets all the way through it, but it's just because things are bigger, things are more expensive, you need more of them. But especially when you talk about, lighting controls, I mean, this isn't just hey, we're going to add in another, paradigm processor and call it a day. It's no. Now it's the hours of programming that goes into this. And now it's how do we program touch screens? Who needs to operate the systems? How does this work inside of a classroom environment versus how does this work inside of a multi-purpose space? And how does this multi-purpose space even operate when you don't have technicians there on something that is a full stage with broadcast lighting and full audio systems and everything along those lines? And so it's a lot of back and forth in-person conversations, in my opinion. Getting into okay, well, yes, we like these products, but what's the actual best product? And I think that's the part that gets missed a lot.
Right, and I would say that that's a pretty consistent thing in lighting controls in general. It's just that in houses of worship and other specialty spaces like that, if you don't have those conversations, what could happen as a result of not finding out what they want is dissatisfaction with the project, with the results. And so I'm curious, have you ever come across, have you ever had to come in after the fact when somebody else botched a job and remedied that?
Yeah, I've had a couple of those. The biggest problem across the board, especially with architectural systems, always seems to be end user configurability. And how easy is it for it to do, or is it something that's even possible, as we're finding with some of the architectural processors? Some of them are very locked down, and so you really can't program them. You can't really get into them a lot. And then some of them are just this open space of everything over, if you can think it, you can do it kind of a thing. Both have their advantages depending on the customer. Both of them are great. It's really, you have to do them early. I think you really hit the home run on that. I think a better way of also looking at that as well is infrastructure. You have to look at the infrastructure that you're installing for these systems. A lot of the systems that I'm finding in architectural sides, they allow you to do some of the button panels or some of the touch screens as a Cat5 alternate as a cable run, instead of using your standard Belden 8127 or whatever that Belden is. That's 2-wire. Which everybody seems to use, but there's always a Cat5 variant, and I will always put in that extra inside of any one of my designs of hey, buy the adapter, put in Cat5, and it doesn't matter what you do in the future. If you want to change it to a different system, if you want to do it, whatever, you've got Cat5, and at this point, it's Cat5 is king.
Yeah, right. I mean, everyone's going network for everything, so that does make a lot of sense, right? To be able to do that. Now, when you're walking into these spaces and you're having these conversations, we typically have a lot of discussions with people regarding how that works in the architectural world, where you're a lot of times having those conversations with, whether it's the lighting designer or controls designer or the architect, and we don't always get to the owner. And how does that differ in the church market? Is the owner more heavily involved? There's going to be sort of multiple parts to this, right? So how does that work? And then there's such a big piece of AV integration, and that's so important in this control system. So I'd love if you could speak to that as well, because that is such a huge part of those conversations.
Yeah. In house of worship, what I always found as an LD is I probably went that extra step that a lot of them don't, which is I do talk to the people who have to use the space. So this is me going to my ministry directors, or it's going to, the people who are actually holding the classrooms, or whoever manages the classes and all that kind of stuff, and just go, hey, when you walk into this space, what do you need to accomplish what you need to accomplish? Taking all that into account, am I 100% successful in getting what everybody wants? No. But I can at least get close, or I can at least try to offer solutions. Is okay, well, this person wants this and this person kind of can fit into this a little bit. Can both of you guys get on the same page and maybe we can get somewhere a little bit faster, kind of a thing. As an outside consultant, it's very hard to get all the way down into that level. And so I kind of just have to take the technician's viewpoint at face value, which is hard, because then a lot of times a year later, I'll get a phone call from them and it's just like, hey, so this room needs to do this now, even though we thought that it needs to do this, but you know how it works in churches. This was now a multi-purpose space and now it's our youth center, so now it needs to do all these other things versus this. And it's like, okay, so let's I don't want to redesign your whole system, because that's just going to be even more of a pain. So let's try to adapt something and let's try to kind of keep it going. As an AV install company, I feel sorry for them, to be quite honest, because getting all the way down to that granular level and even pushing the technicians that they're having conversations with at the church or the project managers, you have to take it at face value and do all those kinds of things. I love walking into churches and I love consulting. And when I was doing, church installs as a whole, somebody who would give me a spec sheet of just okay, exactly what I was saying over. This classroom needs to have these functions. I don't care how it happens, but I need to have this list of functions. And then inside of this room, I need to have this list of functions. And then I would always take that and just go, okay, look, I can meet these. Have you thought about X? And always try to push them a little bit farther out of that comfort zone. Sometimes it was that immediate of oh, no, we're never going to do that. We're totally good. Thank you for bringing that up. But we will never do that kind of a thing. And I go, okay, great. Just wanting to make sure, because now's the best time to do this. You can pull cable once during an install, during a new build. Really easy. All the conduits are open. All the walls are open. Everything's great. You get one day into that install being finished after drywall is done, forget about it. That same thing just 10x'd its cost just to make it happen. And so as a consultant and as an AV installer, I guess the only words of advice I could give, which is, use your history, use what you've seen your other houses of worship do, even if they're different religious types, even if they're different houses of worship, it doesn't matter. Realistically, we've seen what has happened, how people have changed, and help push them a little bit out of that comfort zone a little bit.
Well, and it's interesting. You say you call it a spec sheet. I would call that a control intent narrative, or even an owner project requirements that you're getting. I mean, it really doesn't matter. But the point is that they actually hand you a document that says this is what we want, which is fantastic. Outside of these specialty construction projects, you rarely get that opportunity to have that precision coming directly from the occupants or owners of the project. So it's really quite phenomenal to hear that is kind of a norm inside the house of worship territories because of that. And so, do you then, you were talking about, you get it, then you start going down the control intent narrative, kind of reading through and then identifying additional things that they might not have included. And so, do you have sort of some suggestions for people who who might be unfamiliar with receiving an owner project requirements or a control intent narrative? What are some tips and tricks that you use to kind of identify missing criteria?
A lot of the missing stuff really just comes from years of being involved inside of churches and being a little bit active inside of it. When I'm inside of an auditorium, so just generically, it doesn't matter what church it is, I'm inside of an auditorium. Nobody ever thinks to put lights on the front edge of their stage on the floor. Everybody wants to put lights on the stage. Nobody wants to put anything on the floor in front of the stage. And then I always ask one question: are you ever going to have a wedding inside of this place? Because if you're going to have a wedding in the auditorium, no one's going to have to want to walk upstairs. No bride in the world is going to have to walk to the side of a stage, come upstairs, walk across. It's just not a thing. And so it's the little things like that. Classrooms, probably the biggest one that I think gets missed a lot is simply just time and date control. A lot of facility operators for buildings do not take into account of how powerful being able it is to just program something and let it go. A lot of times they'll go, oh yeah, I'll walk over and just do this light switch every single day. and you're just going to go, okay, well, great. I hate to, it's the hit by bus mentality. Okay, great. You get hit by a
Right.
bus. Who knows now when they show up at 5 a.m.
Yep.
on Sunday morning to start to get the lobby ready or to start to get this classroom ready, that they have to go and walk around and hit every single one of these light switches versus taking the networked, building automation control side of it and going forward. Also, as much as I want to say that it is a normal thing to get a spec sheet from a church or a control diagram for it, I wish it was more normal than what it is. When you're working with a church that's done a build out before, when they hand you one of these and go, this is what we need to happen, because every single one of those churches has learned from experience that they have missed something did not equate from a conversation into actual build out, and then they become unhappy after the fact. And so they've turned this into almost a, hey, this is what we need to have happen, and if it doesn't happen, then we at least can go back and say, hey, we told you this needs to happen. So it's a little bit more towards their benefit than it is to yours.
But I would say that that's always the case, and it's, I think, from these specialty spaces like a house of worship, I mean, it in all intents and purposes functions very similarly to a theater. And so having that kind of documentation, like you said, is a trial by fire learning experience. And if they don't have it, then they really need to grab the shoulders of the people they're working with and say, this is what we need. But I would say that that's consistent throughout. I mean, the reason why we ask for an owner project requirement or a control intent narrative or something that's documented by the owner or occupants is for that confirmation, so that everybody's safeguarded throughout the project. And ultimately that, the owner's desire is protected. But, it's just, I would say that as much as you want it more and more, I would say a lot of commercial lighting and lighting controls designers just want it at all. And so it's we do want to see this start becoming a more common practice, but I totally understand that it's there are groups where you just don't get that. And so in that situation where you have a group that doesn't hand you a document, is there something that you do in that scenario?
I look at it a little bit of what's the intent behind the room, kind of a thing. So it's okay, it's a classroom. Well, generically, it doesn't matter who you are. What happens inside of a classroom just from school. So, okay, maybe it's lights on, lights off. Maybe it's a projector turning on, screen coming down, and maybe some microphone controls. It's okay, that's a pretty basic thing to look at for a classroom. The house of worships, they might take it a little bit farther to where it's oh, no, I want to have dimmable house lights. And so that's always a thing. Sometimes they'll just go, oh yeah, we need house light control. Oh, okay. Do you need that on or off? Or do you want that to dim? Do you want a 50% setting and a 25% setting for if you're having a prayer time, or if you want to watch a video on the screen or anything like that? Because all of these things kind of stack up into what is control. And a lot of times they go into this whole on-off scenario. They get stuck with commercial grade 0 to 10 volt control that has a shut off at 10% dimming curve. And then nobody wants to have to deal with that immediate 10% out of 1,000 lumen fixture. And now all of a sudden you've got 100 lumens off of 15 fixtures inside of a space blasting at you. Nobody kind of takes into account. So little things like that of just okay, well, what's the intention behind the space? Even if you're not a house of worship person, being able to relate it to something, and then just having those raw and honest conversations with the churches. That's on the installer side. On the house of worship side, the biggest recommendation that I always give is bring in a consultant company. Either find somebody that or bring in a consultant who has done this before, because they're going to know all those little things to be able to help you talk to that AVL installer to go, oh, no. Yes, they want house light control, but the consultant takes a step and says, no, I need that to dim. And then the AVL guys go, oh, yeah, okay, this now makes a lot more sense, kind of a thing, because there is just sometimes a disconnect there. It's hard.
Right.
Yeah. All right. I've got 2 questions for you. I'll hit you with the easy one first. So you kind of started to touch on it there with the hire consultant, because I'm very curious, when you walk into a lot of these churches, as we all know, there are a lot of volunteers in various church groups. So how does that work? But let's assume for a second there is no consultant, and you're dealing with Janine, and then all of a sudden you find out the next day that Janine had no say-so in anything, and you needed to talk to Jim. How does that work when you're dealing with volunteers like that?
Volunteers make it hard, especially when you're looking at build out projects. A lot of times what I will tend to do is come in there and just say, okay, who is the technical director? I want to talk with them. Whoever is that lighting person at that point in time, I want it to get filtered through the TD. And I'll explain that a little bit over like, hey, I know you don't have a full-time lighting person. Your TD is realistically going to be the one who is responsible for everything that is entertainment or everything that is controlled source inside of this venue. And so I as an installer would really like to work with just directly the TD. If the TD wants to bring somebody into a conversation that we're going to have, totally fine with it. Absolutely encourage it. But it's okay, this technical director has the final say. I need to hear it from them before I can act upon anything, quote upon anything, and kind of go from there. It's an accountability thing on both sides. I think it helps the church a little bit as well over just going, okay, yeah, this person's my project manager. If I have a question about anything this comes with, I know who I can go to talk to as a senior pastor, a campus pastor, whatever it is. I can talk to this one person versus a volunteer who gets a new job within 2 weeks, kind of in your scenario. And then all of a sudden it's like, hey, great. Peace out. I'm leaving. Time to go to somewhere else across the state. And now all of that information just kind of goes with them. And so that's where it gets hard. But the other half of that is documentation. I love verbal conversations. Absolutely love them. I will follow every single one of them up with a brief email that says, this is what we agreed upon. And go from there. It's not because I'm trying to throw something back at you. And I explained this when I talked to a lot of churches when I was doing consulting stuff. I was just like, look, I'm not trying to throw you under the bus. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and we're very clear. And a lot of it goes back to that whole budgetary thing that we started talking about before. When you're working with installs that have tight budgets, change orders are a killer. And so if we can get all of our ducks in the row up front and we're all on the same page and understand what's going on, it reduces those change orders as much as possible. There was one install that I did. I actually got a lighting change order done, one in total for the entire install on about a 3,200 seat auditorium. It was absolutely crazy. There was so much time that I had to spend with that particular customer in a boardroom with printed out drawings and actual red pencil going through and marking everything as it was getting designed on almost a bi-daily basis or an every other day kind of a basis. It's possible, but you've got to be willing to put in that upfront time.
Right. Well, and I think that's a really good point when it comes to change orders or just project design in general. Upfront work is actually so much more effective than the rush job at the very end to make sure that you have at least something on page. So like having those early and thorough conversations really does ultimately reward you with a more effective project design. Now that is, again, to Ron's point, so long as you're talking to the right people. And so you could spin your wheels talking to the wrong person for hours and hours and hours, and then suddenly it's like, oh, that's not what we want. Like, I was talking to this person. So confirmation of who you're talking to also is really big. And so what happens if it's unclear who you need to talk to? Like if, say, for instance, you say, I want to talk to your technical director, and everybody's kind of looking over their shoulders and are like, I don't know who that is. What do you do in that situation?
I'll move upwards. So I'll go, who's the project manager? And then if that one is even still like a little thing, it's okay, great. Who's the campus pastor? I will never go to the executive pastor, senior pastor, whatever they want to call them, whoever is the lead of the church. I will never get to that level. They have way too much on their plate doing everything else that if the church is legitimately looking to them to manage the project and everything that's going on, that's a red flag in my opinion. And that's going to create problems down the road. And so I will typically just kind of keep going down that church hierarchy of control of like, okay, well, great. Who's this person? What about this person? What about this person? Or If things really start getting bad, then it's okay, who's the EC? I'm going to work underneath them, even as an AVL installer. Because realistically, everything that we do is all electrical. I mean, everything, lighting, everything, video, everything. It's all has to get either a low volt pole by electrical contractor or it's a high volt pole by electrical contractor. The control and data side and programming, great. I can do that all day long. They don't have to touch that. But I will start working almost directly more with the electrical contractors at that point as an absolute last resort.
And so just to clarify here, we're primarily talking about design build. Is that accurate?
Yep. Yeah.
And so design build has a little bit of a different format than design bid build, where you have a bid kind of wedged in between. In design build, you usually have the contractors involved from the beginning of the project. And so in that case, the documentation is more just confirmation and communication with those contractors rather than, okay, this is going to go out to bid and there might be some RFIs that come back for that. So there's sort of a juggling act here of which is better, but I would say, in some cases, design build is easier because of that clear communication channel. And so what you're saying is when you get hired in a situation where it's unclear where the order of who is in charge of this project sits, you'll request that you work under the electrical contractor as a subcontractor to them so that you can protect yourself.
Yeah, it's a little bit of that. It's a little sneaky. I'm not a massive fan of it. I've never had to do it, luckily, which is really good. And it's simply because as soon as you have to get into that level of conversation, the one time that it did get there, the EC then inflated my cost because of the cost of having to, quote, protect my own company, even though I was, completely vetted, all the other stuff, like I was clean. But there's a markup for everything and everybody has to make money on everything. And so even if that's a 10% or a 20% markup, that's still 10% or 20% in legitimately just paperwork fees that churches just flat out don't want to pay. Even when I still like freelance today with churches, when I walk in and they don't have a lighting person, I'll go in there and I'll just like, hey, you know what? Here's the way this works. I can go in there and here's my day rate and I can fix your problem and we can go forth. Or I'll throw you a 50% discount if you have somebody stand behind me the whole time who actually will be able to understand what I'm doing. And it's not that I don't want you to call me back. I will happily take your money. Do not get me wrong. But I also kind of want you to feel like you own your system. I want you to be able to understand that. And so rather than me consistently being this crutch, if you will, that keeps hobbling them along whenever I am available because I'm busy and you're all busy. And, I have this moral thing of like, I actually want to help my customers. And so like, I want somebody to actually feel like they can own their system. So if that's a 50% cost on my side that I give up to make that happen, I will happily do so to make that happen.
Well, and I think that also kind of addresses the adage of, teaching somebody to fish versus fishing for them. If they know how to handle their lighting control system, they may come back to you for more expansive reasons rather than just, hey, can you tighten this screw? It's going to be, hey, I want to add a whole nother annex to this project. Can you help me design that and implement it? And so I would say that it really is more of an investment, but as a result, you really are kind of looking at the longer perspective of that project.
Yeah. Houses of worship are very relational businesses. Everything is relation, flat out. And we're starting to, I feel like we're starting to see this as an industry as a whole. Take the entire entertainment lighting industry as a whole, whether you're a dealer or a production company, everything is relationship. They want to know that you're there to help them and they know that they can support you and all these other things and back and forth. When you've got a problem, they know they're going to call their friends. That's how this kind of goes. Good, bad, ugly, however that works. We're all super relational behind it. Churches take that, I think, one level even more extreme to where once you do something for them, once they figure out they like you and they can trust you, if you throw on the, hey, I used to work in churches hat a little bit more, I mean, the relationship at that point is pretty much done and sold, and they will call you on every single little thing just to say, hey, this person's saying this. We just want to confirm this before we do everything. And as a person at that point in time, you have to go, okay, well, great. This is a 10-minute phone call conversation. Am I really going to bill them for that? No. Just
Right.
Yeah.
spend the 10 minutes on the phone, create that relationship. We're all better amongst it between each other. We all want to succeed. We all want the best inside of everything. And so I very much take that approach to a lot of stuff that I do.
Yeah, we feel this. I know both Webster and I feel the same way. That's how we operate too at Port. Right, it's such a big thing for us. Relationships, like you said, we deal with a lot of theaters. We're dealing with a lot of. It's the English teacher on a stipend who's teaching the kids. When they call and they have a question about their lighting console, no, I'm not going to send them a bill for the 20 minutes or 30 minutes I sat on the phone walking them through how to patch their console. Like it's they don't know what they don't know, and it's all about teaching and relationships, and you want them to call you back, and at the end of the day, right, it's a huge part of that and wanting to teach them to do it. But it's also about, like you said, spending the time to make sure the person behind you understands how to use the system, and that they do understand it. I mean, you're talking about extremely complicated systems in some of these cases with these churches. And if they don't know, the first reaction, unfortunately for some people, is to freak out and say, it didn't work. The system's broken. I don't know. And right. And then they point, and then it gets to the next person and the next person. And it makes its way to you, and someone's screaming. And then you've got to figure it out to just turn around and go, well, they just needed to press this. And it was right. I mean, but no one wants to, you don't want to get there. You don't want to have to get to the point where you're now on an emergency call to get there. People are screaming to find out that, well, it was just the board op didn't understand what they were doing. But in reality, it's because we didn't spend enough time training said board op. And it's a bad look for everybody. Right. And that in an industry as a whole, entertainment, everything, architectural, that's what we're trying to fix, right? Education is such a big piece of what we're trying to do so that we can bring up the next, level of technicians, the growing industry, and just, make sure that everyone has an understanding and a good experience, because it can get brutal when things head down that road. So, all right, I'm curious. You mentioned AVL a couple of times now. And so for everybody listening may not understand what an AVL contractor is. Would you mind actually explaining that to everybody?
So AVL, of course, audio, video, lighting is kind of how that goes. An AVL contractor or a dealer or an installer is kind of that little tagline. So they're an AVL installer, they're an AVL dealer. They all kind of do their each kind of things. Pretty much what they do when they come into a design build project or even a bid project is they can look at that specification sheet over what needs to happen or what needs to happen inside of each one of these spaces and be able to design full audio systems, full video systems, and full lighting systems. And more times than not, figure out how do these need to actually work together and not as individual things to get to the success of it, to a kind of a thing. But they're typically the ones that are going to be the boots on the ground, the ones that are actually going to be, actually programming, finding those solutions with the customers, but being able to have that advanced AV background that like we most have at this point and kind of go from there.
So I'm curious, do you find an advantage, and I'm going to assume you do, to using a sole source contractor who can do everything versus individual contractors to handle their pieces of the pie?
Always. I'm always I like simplicity in everything that I do. When I have a problem on an install, I want to be able to call one person. There was even a number of installs that I got into, which was not only a sole source contractor, but a sole source manufacturer at that point in time. So I knew that when I installed this system, that every single piece of the pie amongst maybe all the different brands that they have, it's like, oh, well, if I have an RMA issue or if I have a tech support issue or if I have a training issue or any of those things, not only am I just calling my one sole source contractor, I can call my one sole source manufacturer at that point in time. Now, there's a drawback to this, though. Some sole source contractors and manufacturers don't have the range of product offering that you can get by going to all the different bits and pieces and bits and bobs. But sometimes, and what I'm finding more times than not, is I would much rather get into those scenarios where I have to compromise than able to make it simple inside of the long run. And this is me 5-10 years in the future when it's like, oh man, it's time to replace my lights. They've reached, their 10-year mark. It's starting to kind of get there. And I can bring back in that same exact contractor and go, hey, and they go, oh, that's right. We remember this project. We did all this. We know where everything is. And again, it goes back to that whole relationship thing between it, and it makes it that much simpler. So there is a drawback. You might not be able to get all the fancy bells and whistles that you might be able to get to by piecemealing. But when it comes to support, stability, and then I think the long-term advantages are far outweigh the other side.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think, in that regard, it is sort of an ecosystem versus custom solution, which, in North America, nobody's a stranger to that at this point. We have nothing but proprietary systems in most cases. And so having those proprietary systems be more expansive and covering more ground than just the lighting, that kind of makes sense in the way that we do things. And so having what you're referring to as a sole source resource, which is really, again, in most cases, a proprietary system, there's a lot of benefits to that. And at the same time, if you do want those elevated capabilities that only come from custom solutions, then yeah, you kind of need to have, you need to think long term about that, because who's going to maintain it 10 years down the road when there's an issue with it? Because, with a proprietary system, there's going to be a 1-800 number that you can call and they're going to help you out. Whereas with a custom solution, it's the person that installed it and that's it. So, there is some pro con to all of that. At the same time, like you said, there's a limit. Proprietary systems are proprietary systems. They don't get to expand past what they're capable of doing. And so it's just this pro-con situation. But I think, to your point, there are some excellent proprietary systems designed specifically for whatever these specialty projects are, houses of worship, theaters, classrooms, that you can really shortlist and know, yeah, it's going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very powerful thing to make an ecosystem as a whole.
Totally.
even if it comes down to, when I get into manufacturers of product, even sometimes I just look at, okay, well, who's actually design built for the AV market? Because there are a lot of solutions out there that we can tap into for lighting control, that we can tap into that are like, oh yeah, this is meant for the mall. This is meant for, this outside performing arts center that, is not necessarily what we're doing as an industry. So like, what are the products that are like, no, this was designed for us. This was designed for a theater.
How do you identify those?
Conversations with the manufacturer or with the sales or whoever my dealer is at that point in time over who do they trust. Which brings up the other topic of like, if I'm working relationally, if you will, with my AV installer at that point in time, it's like, okay, well, where's their comfort zone? Because I don't want to take them out of the products that they know and they trust more than anything, because they're going to be the ones that know that stuff. So, if this becomes buying, X product versus Y product and they know X product, I don't care why I thought Y product might be great. I'm going to go with X. Just because it keeps everything down. It keeps it simple. I know at that point in time that they know and trust and go for this. And so I kind of lean a little bit more on the AV installers to make that happen.
Which is another nice thing about design build, because in design bid build, you can't account for that. You can't have the conversation during the design process with every single contractor under the sun who's going to bid on the project and go, okay, which system are you familiar with? You have to roll with the fact that they may be unfamiliar with your system. So having the contractor involved early on in the project, especially for these specialty projects, really benefits it. We're almost out of time here, so I kind of want to wrap up what we've talked about here. I mean, it's really good stuff, and it's really lovely to hear, a specifier, designer, consultant who actually takes the time to have these early conversations, because they're critical things to happen that really are infrequent right now outside of specialty applications. But, with your experience, I mean, not just with houses of worship, but with classrooms and other lighting controls applications, I mean, really having that conversation at the beginning, and not just with anybody, but with the right people, is critical to the success of the project. And if you do get a document in order project requirements from the group, you can kind of quickly understand that, okay, they've been burned before, and they're trying to cover their butts by giving me this document. But outside of that, you do still need to kind of pry into them and understand what is the intent of the space, what is the intent of the project. Are there parameters that they may not have thought about yet that I need to bring up now so that we can kind of narrow down the pool of options and really make sure that the project's going to be a successful one. But then outside of that, having confirmation, sending a confirmation email post conversation, or bringing in drawings and doing red lines right on top of those drawings with the owners and occupants of the building, and consistently having conversations right up until the point that you're ready to start installing. Because, as you said, once things are installed, it is so much harder to go back and add something or redact something. So making sure that it's clear, and in the case of design build, you get to have the contractors involved in those conversations, so you can really say, okay, are you familiar with this? Do you know how this works? What have you done in the past? Sort of, so that you can get a read on them if you're unfamiliar with them. But if you create those relationships and you get familiar with these people, you can then create a rapport and be able to move quicker on projects going forward. So you can have these shorthands and say, okay, remember what we did on this project? Well, we're going to do a similar thing, except for this, this, and this. But that brings in the other point. When it comes to specialty spaces like houses of worship, there is no cookie cutter. You can't copy paste it ever. And you really need to make sure that your design is specific to that project. And because otherwise, if you take the design of one project and just lay it on top of another project, odds are it's going to go poorly, because of the fact that it's just not tailored to what the occupants owners are expecting, as well as each venue has its own nuances. Each space has its own unique characteristics, and thinking through how you're going to be using those components. And additionally, one idea that people do like to roll forward is manual on-off switches in spaces that, okay, that's not really a good thing anymore, because of the fact that, like you said, if that person who knows where that switch is gets hit by a bus tomorrow, who's going to know that that switch is there? And then suddenly that light, whatever that functionality that switch is controlling, is no longer going to be incorporated, and could be a life safety thing, or it could be something that really protects somebody from hazards. So really ensuring that there's ongoing continuity of knowledge and information, as well as, tracking, okay, who needs to get trained? Who needs this information, so that I don't get those nuisance calls 24/7. They can take care of the little issues, and then I can come in and help with bigger issues that are more complex. And so, yeah, it might take like a couple of days of training with that person to get them familiar with the system, but that's 2 days of investment that then pay back in the end. And so, all of that is a lot of time to make sure that it's going to work out in the end. But it is worth it, because time spent earlier, wherever that stage is going to pay back, because you're not going to have to spend as much time later on in the project. Did I miss anything?
Yeah. No.
No, I mean, that is the most amazing summary in the world. I think one better way, just to make it even shorter, would just be keep the mentality of do it right the first time.
Right.
Yep.
Just do it right the first time. If that means you have to spend the extra, because doing it now is still always going to be better than doing it later and having regrets inside of it. So it's just do it right the first time.
Yeah, and I think that says a lot too to the idea of having a sole source integrator on some of these things. Because when, like you mentioned about the service calls, when no one wants the call that, oh, the video screen's not working when I press the button anymore, we're having this issue. Oh no, it's that's being controlled by the lighting system. So the lighting's, you got to call him. No, okay, it's the command is getting there. So it's the video. I need the video guy. Like, yes, right. In certain applications, it makes more sense to have individual entities, but in these design build projects like this that are so heavily integrated, having one person to call can make such a difference in the experience. And I think it's important for a lot of people to realize, like, most smaller churches, like up in the Northeast in our area, don't have a lot of, lighting, a lot of production. And I think people don't realize that a lot of these larger churches, they're not even theaters. They really are more of a theme park, right? They're a themed environment, and it starts the second you walk in the door, right? It all integrated in. And I don't think people realize how much goes into all of that. And that's part of why it's so important to have that sort of sole source that can really be that one phone call for you when there's a problem.
Yeah, especially when
So,
you do have a smaller church, as you guys were talking about with volunteers. It's when you don't have that stable being, or sometimes it's that worship leader that's also doing technical stuff, who they've got to worry about a band and all their musical stuff, which I completely give them credit for, because that is more than what I would want to do. It's a lot easier for them to also have that relational partner with that person as well, of just going, hey, this isn't working and I don't even know where to start, kind of a thing. And
yep.
so that sole
Yep.
source, it's very important. I agree.
That's awesome. Anthony, thank you so much, man. This has been a great conversation, and I think it's such a unique application and a different sort of taste for our listeners, right? Who we're always talking about architectural and this, and we spend a decent amount of time on theater. So to kind of dive into the church market a little bit is such a unique application for people to sort of hear about and get a little taste of, right? Because that's really all we, in 45 minutes, that's all we got.
Right.
It's just a little taste of how that actually goes. So yeah, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Absolutely a pleasure.
I will close us out and just remind everyone, today's episode is presented by the LCA, the Lighting Controls Association.
And it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. Check out our website, lightingcontrolspodcast.com. Got all of our episodes, a news feed, and more. But until then, thank you so much for joining us. And Anthony, it's been awesome chatting with you. Thank you so much for joining.